I've told this story exactly twice before today. Once to the Accident Review Board of the Devhari Extraction Consortium, and once to my breeding sister, Osveth, in the dark of our shared quarters on the night I came home. The review board wanted numbers, seal tolerances, pressure differentials, response times, the count of workers alive at the end versus the count of workers alive at the beginning. I gave them numbers. Osveth wanted the truth. I gave her something closer to it, but not the whole of it, because the whole of it requires me to say plainly what I did in the 14 months before the failure, and what I was, and I was not ready to say that to someone who still thought well of me. I am saying it now. I am saying it here, in this record, because the Veth Karal Extraction Consortium has asked for a full account to be deposited in the station memory archive, and because I have decided that if I am going to put words in the archive, they will be honest ones. Whatever else I have been, I will not be the kind of administrator who launders a catastrophe into a procedural narrative. So, here is what I was. I was third intake coordinator of Devhari Drilling Station, assigned to the platform 14 months before the cascade, 31 carapace cycles old, which in Veth Karal reckoning means I had survived 3 full molts and was considered experienced enough to hold a coordination post but not yet senior enough to sit in the director's tier. My function was routing, incoming supply shipments, outgoing ore concentrates, maintenance contract renewals, labor rotation schedules, certification audits, paperwork in the colloquial sense, the kind of work that is invisible when it functions and catastrophic when it does not. I was good at it. I am not saying that to salvage my dignity. I was genuinely good at the routing function. My renewal records were clean, my audit scores were high, and in the 14 months I served at Devhari, I had not once allowed a substandard contractor through intake. The certification filters I maintained were the strictest on the Devhari platform cluster. Vessels arriving at Devhari for service or supply contracts were required to carry a full Galactic Aid and Commerce Registry endorsement. Class 3 minimum for consumable supply runs, Class 1 for any structural or engineering work. I enforce this without exception. I want to be clear about that word, without exception. I mean it literally. In 14 months, I rejected 47 incoming contract applications. 17 of those rejections were for minor documentation lapses that could have been corrected within a station day. Rejected them anyway and required full reapplication. I was not cruel. I was, as I saw it at the time, rigorous. The registry existed for a reason. The certification classes existed for a reason. A drilling platform in a gas giant's upper atmosphere, 612 workers aboard, and a continuous extraction operation running at full bore is not a place where you permit substandard operators through the airlock because they have a sympathetic story. The sympathetic stories of those 14 months were mostly human. I need to explain this carefully because I am aware of how it sounds now, and I want to be precise about what I actually believed then, rather than constructing a convenient memory. I did not hate humans. I did not think them dangerous or malicious. What I thought, what most of the Veth Karal administrative tier thought, at that time, in the aftermath of the third registry expansion debates, was that humanity's approach to spaceflight was fundamentally undisciplined, maliciously so, innocently so, naively so, the way a creature is naive when it has not yet learned that the universe is not forgiving of causation. The registry existed because species before humanity had improvised their way into disasters. Unvetted ships with substandard seals, carrying the wrong cargo in the wrong configuration to the wrong station, and the wrong station losing pressure, and the workers inside losing everything. The registry was the answer to those disasters. It was a structured body of certification requirements, inspection schedules, and liability frameworks that any species operating in registered space had to meet before they were permitted to offer commercial or relief services. It was, in the language of its founding charter, the guarantee that help would not become harm. Humans had failed their first registry certification attempt. They had failed the second. They were in the middle of appealing the third rejection when the Devhari cascade began. Their ships, the bulk of their commercial and relief fleet, operated under provisional transit permits that allowed them to move through registered space but barred them from taking on service contracts, engineering work, or emergency response engagements. They were, in the legal vocabulary of the registry, unendorsed operating entities. In the informal vocabulary of the Ostivari intake office, we called them the unregistered. I had rejected 6 human applications in my 14 months at Ostivari. One of them was from a convoy captain named Hartwell, who had submitted a Class 1 structural endorsement application for a scheduled maintenance run on our lower extraction manifold. Her credentials were extensive. 40 years of platform maintenance work across 8 different station types, including 2 stations in gas giant atmospheres not similar to Devhari primes. Her ship, the Meridian Compact, was inspected and found to carry equipment rated to standards that, while not registry certified, exceeded our manifold's operational tolerances by a significant margin. I rejected the application. I did it correctly by the book, full documentation, and a form letter that explained the registry Class 1 requirement and provided links to the certification pathway. I did not think about Captain Hartwell again after that. I had 47 other applications to process and a certification audit coming up, and the lower extraction manifold would be serviced by a registry-endorsed contractor at somewhat greater expense and 2 weeks later than the original maintenance window. The registry contractor did adequate work. The manifold held. I tell you not to argue that my rejection caused the cascade. It did not. The cascade had a different origin. A thermal expansion failure in the primary seal ring of extraction column 7 was a structural engineering problem unrelated to the lower manifold. I tell you this because I want you to understand the texture of my reasoning in those 14 months, so that what came after is legible. I was not a villain. I was an administrator following policy in an organization that had built its safety record on following policy, and I believed that the policy was correct, and I was, in the specific sense that mattered when column 7 failed, wrong. The cascade began on the 43rd day of the Devhari summer cycle, which is when the gas giant's upper atmosphere enters a thermal intensification phase and the extraction platforms go to elevated monitoring status. We had been at elevated status for 11 days. Everything was nominal. Column 7 had passed its pre-season inspection. The thermal expansion of the primary seal ring was within predicted parameters on the morning of 43rd day. By the afternoon of the 43rd day, the seal ring had exceeded its failure threshold and column 7 was venting. I will not describe the technical sequence in detail here. The review board record contains all of that, and it is comprehensive. What I will describe is what it felt like to be me, standing in the intake coordination office on the station's equatorial deck, watching the alert board light up in a pattern I had never seen outside of a drill scenario, while the station's automated response protocols engaged and immediately ran into the first of several walls. The first wall was containment. The automated bulkhead system was designed to isolate a venting column within 90 seconds of seal failure detection. Column 7's failure geometry, the way the ring fractured along an oblique plane rather than a clean radial split, produced a pressure wave that damaged 2 of the 3 bulkhead actuators before they could engage. The third actuator sealed its section. It was not enough. The column was partially isolated, but not fully contained, and the station's pressure management system began working against itself, trying to maintain extraction operations in the functioning columns while managing the loss from column 7, and doing neither effectively. The second wall was repair. Ostivari's onboard engineering complement was rated for routine maintenance and minor emergency response. Partial seal failure in a primary extraction column under active gas giant atmospheric pressure was not a minor emergency. Engineers could slow the deterioration. They could not stop it. The station required external structural support, a specialized team with pressure-rated equipment, and the specific tool set for Class 1 atmospheric extraction repairs. The station director, second coordinator Vasathi, filed the emergency assistance request through registry channels within 4 minutes of the cascade confirmation. The request was Class 1 priority, which by registry protocol should trigger a response from the nearest certified emergency response fleet within 6 hours. The nearest certified emergency response fleet was the Consortium Heavy Response Group, based at Devhari Outer Station, 11 hours away at standard transit. They acknowledged the request. They confirmed their Class 1 certification and their available complement. They also confirmed, after a consultation period that I remember as lasting approximately 40 minutes but which the board record shows was 32 minutes, that their current fleet was committed to a scheduled maintenance operation at Davari Outer, and that deploying to Davari would require a cascade clause waiver from the Registry Operations Directorate. The Registry Operations Directorate was contacted. The waiver process, we were told, typically required between 8 and 12 hours. Column 7 was at that point approximately 14 hours from a structural failure that would compromise the station's primary support frame. 612 workers. The second certified response option was the Galactic Commerce Emergency Relay, a network of pre-positioned relief assets maintained by a consortium of registry member species. The nearest relay asset was a Davari engineering vessel, Class 1 certified, positioned at a way station 17 hours distant. They responded promptly and with evident concern. They also had, as it happened, prior commitment, a refueling emergency at a Davari agricultural transport convoy that had declared distress 40 minutes before our request. By the registry's priority adjudication framework, a multi-vessel civilian distress event outranked a single-station industrial emergency. The Davari vessel was directed to the convoy. Third option, the Vethkaral's own emergency contract registry, the list of pre-approved private response firms that Davari maintained for situations where the primary and secondary networks were unavailable. I pulled the list. I called every firm on it. 2 were committed to other emergencies. 1 had a certification lapse that their operations officer discovered, with some embarrassment, while talking to me. 1 was willing to respond, but was 22 hours away, and could not accelerate to a useful intercept within the station's remaining structural window. I remember standing at the intake console after the last of those calls, looking at the alert board, looking at the structural countdown the engineering team had posted on the station-wide display, and experiencing a feeling I do not have clean vocabulary for. It was not panic exactly. I had been trained against panic. It was something more like the specific, very quiet sensation of having the ground removed from beneath a position you had been completely certain was solid. Vasathi came to the intake office. She was old, 6 molts, which in Vethkaral terms is the threshold of elder status, and she moved, with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned long ago that urgency and haste were not the same thing. She looked at my console. She looked at the call log. She looked at the structural countdown. "What about the unregistered?" she said. I heard myself begin to explain the intake policy. She let me get through approximately 1 sentence of it before she raised 1 foreleg in the Veth. For all gesture that means stop, I understand. Proceed to the relevant point. "I know the policy," she said. "I wrote 2/3 of it." "What about the unregistered?" I pulled the intake rejection log. In the last 14 months I had, as noted, rejected 6 human applications. 4 of those vessels had since moved on to other sectors. 1 had been impounded in a registry dispute unrelated to Davari. 1, the Meridian Compact Captain Hartwell, had last been logged at a way station 6 hours from our current position, according to the voluntary position share data that unregistered vessels were encouraged, though not required, to provide. 6 hours. Looked at Vasathi. "They're not certified," I said. This was not an argument. It was, I think, the last fragment of a position I already knew I was abandoning. I said it the way you say the name of something that is leaving. "No," Vasathi said. "They are not. Send the request." I want to be precise about this moment, because the review board asked me about it. And I gave them the administrative account, which was accurate, and I want to give the archive the rest of it. There was a pause between what Vasathi said and what I did that lasted, by the console's timestamp, 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not a long time. It is long enough to know what you are doing and do it anyway, which is different from not knowing. I knew what I was doing. I was sending a distress request to an unregistered operating entity. I was doing this with the full knowledge that it violated the intent of the intake policy I had enforced for 14 months, and with the full knowledge that the intake policy I had enforced for 14 months had, as its premise, proposition that unregistered operators were less capable than registered ones, and that admitting them to service engagements created unacceptable risk. I was about to do this because the alternative was to wait for the registry waiver process and watch the structural countdown, 0. In 4 seconds, I understood something that I had probably been capable of understanding for 14 months and had not, because I had not had occasion to run the comparison. The registry certification was a document about process. The cascade failure was an event in the physical world. The physical world did not know about the document. I sent the request. This is not an oversight. It is deliberate policy. The registry's position, which I had agreed with for 14 months, was that routing emergency requests to unregistered operators would undermine the certification incentive structure and potentially expose distressed stations to additional liability. There was no form for it. There was no channel. There was an open band emergency frequency that all vessels in the Devhari system were legally required to monitor. And I used that, and I said Devhari's name and our coordinates and what we needed, and that we had between 11 and 14 hours before structural failure, and I asked if anyone could respond. The frequency was quiet for 47 seconds. I counted them. Then a voice came back. It was a human voice, flat and unhurried, with the particular quality that I have since come to associate with human professionals in the middle of doing their work. A kind of calm that is not the absence of awareness but the presence of it, very steady, pointed at the problem. Devhari, this is the Meridian Compact. We are 6 hours out on current heading. What's your column configuration? I told her. She asked 3 more questions, very specific, technical questions about the bulkhead actuator failure geometry and the pressure differential across the isolation boundary and what equipment our onboard engineering team had already deployed. I answered them. There was a brief silence while she was, Ace assumed, consulting with her team, and then she came back. We can work with that. We're going to need dock access at your equatorial bay and clearance to bring 9 vessels into your exclusion zone. We have a structural team and the equipment to reseat a fractured primary ring under pressure. It'll take approximately 7 hours on site. Do you have authority to grant that access? Vasathi was standing beside me. She had heard every word. She gave me the authorization code herself. Memory. Access granted, I said. All 9 vessels, equatorial bay, full clearance confirmed. Meridian Compact out. Frequency went quiet. I sat with that silence for a moment. Then I pulled up the intake file I had created 14 months ago for the Meridian Compact, the one with the rejection notice and the form letter explaining the registry Class 1 requirement. I did not close it, I just looked at it. Vasathi had already left the intake office. She had things to do. So did I. The first of the 9 human vessels docked at Devhari's equatorial 5 hours and 51 minutes after that transmission was 9 minutes faster than the Meridian Compact's stated travel time. I was at the bay when the ramp lowered. I want to describe this carefully, because I think the careful description is the honest one. I have seen, in the accounts that circulated afterward among the Vethkaral platform community, a version of this moment that tends toward a certain kind of drama, the hatch opening, the light flooding in, the visitors arriving as saviors in a tableau of gratitude. That is not what I experienced. What I experienced was considerably less cinematic and considerably more strange. The first thing I noticed was that they were smaller than I had expected. I had seen humans in documentation footage and at the registry intake sessions I had attended, and I had formed an image of them as a moderately imposing species, the way any spacefaring species appears imposing in official contexts. At the equatorial bay in working clothes, with equipment crates on grav sleds behind them, they looked compact, efficient, like a tool that had been designed with no extraneous mass. The second thing I noticed was the equipment. Not in a technical assessment sense. I did not have the expertise for that in the first moment. I noticed it the way you notice something that does not fit a category you have been using. I had spent 14 months evaluating equipment against registry certification standards. Registry certified equipment looks a particular way. It carries the certification marks. It arrives in standardized cases. It is accompanied by manifest documents in the registry format. This equipment was marked differently. Some of it bore markings I did not recognize at all. Some of it bore markings that were clearly manufacturer's marks rather than certification marks. All of it had the look, a texture, almost, of things that had been used many times and maintained carefully in between, which is a different look from things that have been used a standard number of times and certified at standard intervals. I registered all of this without fully processing it because Captain Hartwell had already reached me. She was not tall as humans go. She had the coloring that I would later learn the humans call weathered. A kind of tone that comes from long years in variable light conditions, and she moved with the same economy I had noted in her voice on the frequency. Deliberate, not hurried, as though she had calculated the necessary pace and was maintaining it precisely. She was carrying a handheld scanner, and she had it aimed at the bay wall before she had fully cleared the ramp. "Third intake coordinator Exavar," she said. She pronounced my name nearly correctly, which surprised me. "Yes," I said. "I've reviewed the specs you sent. I want to do a quick walk of the isolation boundary before we commit tooling. Maybe 15 minutes. My structural lead is already pulling the column 7 approach data. Are you in a position to accompany us, or do you need to be on the intake board?" I was in that moment the administrative of a station that had 612 workers aboard and approximately 10 hours remaining before a structural failure that the entire certified emergency response network had been unable to address. My intake board had nothing on it. The intake board was irrelevant. The intake board, with its certification fields and its Class 1 requirement boxes, was the most irrelevant object in the entire Devhari system. "I can accompany you," I said. "Shh, shh." She nodded and turned back to give an instruction to the person behind her, who immediately began moving with purpose toward column 7's indicator on the station schematic. Psst. I walked with Captain Hartwell through the equatorial corridor, and the other 8 vessels were docking behind us as we walked. Psst. And I could through the station's ambient noise system, the sounds of equipment being unloaded, and teams assembling, and it had a rhythm to it, a practiced, unhurried rhythm, that I found despite everything, steadying. She talked as we walked, not to me, initially. She was on a channel with her structural lead, a human named Petrov, who I would meet briefly later, and who had the specific quality of ship crew. One has spent so much time solving structural problems that the structure of a problem is the first thing they see in any situation. She was precise with him, and he with her, and what they were discussing was the failure geometry of column 7's seal ring, and it was very clear from the way they discussed it that they understood it. "How long have you worked this type of platform?" I asked. I asked it because I was trying to find solid ground. She glanced at me sideways, the way humans do when they are reassessing a question's intent. "Gas giant extraction?" "About 12 years. Different giant, different species equipment, but the pressure physics are the same. Column 7 seal is a Duvari pattern fabrication. We've worked with those before." "You know Duvari pattern fabrication?" "Studied under a Duvari engineer at the Waypoint 14 apprentice program," she said. "He was very good. He did not think much of our registry certification attempts, either." There was no edge in her voice when she said this. It was not a reproach. It was, as best I could read it, simply a fact she was including because it was relevant context. This was, I would find over the next 7 hours, characteristic of her. She included relevant context. She did not include irrelevant context, and she did not editorialize. We reached the isolation boundary. She ran her scanner along the boundary seam points for 8 minutes without speaking. Then she spoke for 2 minutes to Petrov. Then she turned to me. "Okay," she said, "it's repairable. The ring fractured in 4 places. 3. Your onboard scan missed 1 fracture because it's behind the insulation wrap. That's actually good news because it means the failure was one event, not a propagating sequence. We can reseat and seal all 4 fractures under pressure if we run 2 teams simultaneously from the equatorial axis and the subfloor axis. Total time on the ring work is about 5.5 hours. We'll want to do a pressure test and a hold period after, so call it 7 total. Can you get me a commitment from your director to keep extraction off column 7 until we've cleared the hold?" "I can do that now," I said. Good. She was already turning, already on the channel with Petrov again. Start with the subfloor access, get the secondary team staged. Be there in 10 minutes. I made the call to Vasathi. The commitment was immediate. I relayed it to Captain Hartwell as I jogged. Beth Corral do not run precisely, but there is a gait that is the equivalent. To keep pace with her. Firmed, she said, and kept walking. What happened over the next 7 hours I cannot fully account for from direct observation, because my intake function resumed as additional equipment arrived on the later vessels. And I spent a significant portion of the time coordinating cargo manifests and bay access, and the 2 secondary repair teams that Hartwell's convoy deployed to Column 7's adjacent support structure as a cautionary measure. What I can tell you is what the alert board showed, and what the structural countdown showed, and what I heard on the station-wide communication channel. But I can also tell you some of what I saw, because between manifests I walked the station. I am not certain why. The intake console was where my work was, for no administrative reason to be in the corridors. I think I needed to understand what I was coordinating, in a way that numbers on a screen could not give me, and so I walked. The station had a particular quality in those hours. The workers knew. The station-wide alerts had made certain of that. And they were conducting themselves with the disciplined calm of people who have been trained for emergencies and have now encountered one. Shifts were going about their work in the functioning extraction columns. The mess areas were quieter than normal, but not silent. In the corridor adjacent to Column 7's isolation boundary, Hartwell's people were working on the secondary support structure with a piece of equipment I had never seen before. A large, asymmetric frame assembly that they were bolting to the corridor wall with the unhurried efficiency of professionals who have done this bolting before on other walls in other emergencies. One of them was a young woman with close-cropped hair who was working from a diagram on a tablet propped against her equipment case. She was talking quietly to her colleague as she worked, and from the few words I caught as I passed, she was explaining a Talatrank calculator. I stopped walking. I watched for a moment. She became aware of me after perhaps 20 seconds. The way you become aware of something still at the edge of your vision when everything else is in motion. She looked up. Coordinator, she said. She had clearly been briefed on Veth Corral rank insignia, which struck me as a detail that said something. We're reinforcing the lateral load bearing on this section as a precaution. The primary repair is on track, about 4 more hours. I know, I said. I can see it on the board. She nodded and went back to the calculation. I stood there for perhaps another 10 seconds, which I could not fully account for. Then I said to no one in particular, or perhaps to her, "Thank you for coming." She looked up again. She had an open, practical face with the slight squint of someone who spends a lot of time reading instruments in variable lighting conditions. She considered what I had said for a moment, and then she said, with the simplicity that I found, later, when I was turning the day over in my memory, more affecting than any formal acknowledgement. "That's what we do." She went back to the calculation. I walked back to the intake office. The alert board showed a steady, gradual reduction in the pressure differential across Column 7's isolation boundary. Not a dramatic drop, a methodical one, 1 point, then another, over the first 2 hours. By the 3rd hour, the rate of seal deterioration had reversed. By the 4th hour, the primary fracture points were showing signs of initial stabilization. By the 6th hour, Petrov's voice on the station-wide channel said, in the flat tone of someone reading an instrument rather than announcing a triumph, primary ring fracture 1 sealed and holding, moving to fracture 2. The structural countdown. The one the engineering team had posted on the station-wide display, the one that had shown 14 hours when the cascade began, and had been counting down with the grim regularity of a thing that will not be argued, stopped. It did not go away. It stayed on the display. But the engineering team updated it, and the updated number was longer than the previous number. And then it was updated again, and by the time the 7th hour had elapsed, and Captain Hartwell's voice came over the channel to say, "Ostivari, Column 7 primary ring is sealed and pressure tested. Hold period will complete in 40 minutes. Can stand down the structural emergency at that point." The countdown had been extended past the point of immediate relevance. 612 workers. I was at my intake console when she said that. I had the intake log open, and the rejection file for the Meridian Compact, and I was looking at both of them. The hold period took 38 minutes. Then the structural emergency was formally stood down. The station's atmosphere cycled through a full pressure check. Column 7's isolated section was confirmed stable. The alert board cleared, one indicator at a time, like lights going off in a corridor as someone walks away from you. Hartwell's teams began breaking down their equipment at approximately the 8th hour. I went to the equatorial bay. The process of packing up was as orderly as the process of arriving had been. The grav sleds were reloaded. The equipment cases were secured. The personnel from the 8 secondary vessels had already reboarded. The Meridian Compact's crew was the last to finish, and they finished methodically, with no appearance of hurry. I watched this for a while from the bay's observation rail. One of the crew, a young human with the build of someone who does physical work for a, glanced up and saw me watching and gave me a small nod of acknowledgement, then went back to what he was doing. It was not a showy nod. It was the nod of someone who has been seen doing a job and does not particularly need to be thanked for it. Captain Hartwell came last down the corridor from Column 7's access point. She had her scanner in her left hand and her right hand was wrapped around a container of some beverage her crew had been consuming throughout the repair work. Something hot, by the steam, something that I would learn later was a particular kind of stimulant drink that human engineers favor for long operations. She was making notes on a handheld tablet with the hand that held the scanner, the stylus tucked between two fingers, in the practiced manner of someone who has learned to do two things at once, because there are usually two things. I walked down from on the observation rail to meet her. She stopped when she saw me. She looked at me with an expression I did not have a ready interpretation for. Not unfriendly, not particularly warm, simply attentive. The expression of someone who is waiting to hear what you need. I had prepared, in the 40 minutes of the hold period, a formal statement of gratitude on behalf of Ostavari Station, in the Veth Choral administrative style, which involves a specific form of acknowledgement that denotes the magnitude of a service received, and the recorder's awareness of any prior conduct that may have complicated the relationship. It was a good statement. I had written it carefully. I could not say it. I stood in front of her, and I could not find the beginning of it. Because the beginning of it required me to look at her. I found that I could not look at her for long. Not because of anything she had done. Because of the intake file. Because of the form letter explaining the registry Creech Class 1 requirement, which I had sent her 14 months ago, with all the thorough, correct, documented care of an administrator who knows the policy and is sure the policy is right. Because of the 612 workers who were alive at the end of the 7th hour, and the specific quality of the math involved in that. She waited. You came, I said. It was not the statement I had prepared. It was the only sentence I had. You called, she said. Could not tell if this was a rebuke. Her tone was the same flat, unhurried tone. It was simply the answer to what I had said, in the same register that she had described the column 7 repair geometry. Accurate, unembellished. We rejected your application, I said. 18 months ago, I rejected your application. I know, she said. The form letter was very clear. The equipment your team used today exceeded our seal tolerances. Yes, you knew that. We knew what our equipment was capable of, she said. The registry certification is a different question from the capability question. We haven't managed to satisfy the registry about our documentation processes. The capability has been consistent. I was trying to find a way to say what I needed to say, and I was failing at it, because the shape of what I needed to say did not fit any category of administrative language I had been trained in. The administrative language I had been trained in was designed for transactions between parties operating within the same framework. This was something else. You did not have to come, I said. We had no formal agreement. You were not on any contract. The registry would not have held you accountable for not responding. No, she agreed. Why did you come? She considered this for a moment. Not in the way of someone constructing an answer, but in the way of someone locating an answer that already exists, and finding the shortest path to 600 workers, she said. That was the whole answer. She did not elaborate. She did not frame it as a principle or a philosophy or a statement about the relationship between certified and uncertified operators. 600 workers. That was the relevant fact, and she had responded to the relevant fact, and there was no more to say about it than that. I looked at the floor of the equatorial bay. It was a Veth Corral design floor. The hexagonal composite paneling we use on all our extraction platforms, rated for heavy equipment loads and atmosphere-resistant coatings, marked at regular intervals with the yellow and amber loading zone indicators that our certification bureau requires. It was very clean, because Ostevari's maintenance staff was very good, and it was very familiar, because I had walked it every day for 14 months, and I had never in those 14 months looked at it the way I was looking at it now, which was as a floor I was alive to be standing on. The Registry Review Board will have questions, I said, about the access authorization, about the emergency open band request. I expect they will, Captain Hartwell said. She did not sound concerned by this. She sounded, if anything, mildly interested. Vasathi authorized the access. The record is clear on that. I understand. I wanted you to know that the record is clear on that, I said. In case it becomes relevant. She looked at me for a moment with that steady, attentive expression. Then she said, Coordinator Ek Savar, I've been flying outside the registry's approved vendor list for 9 years. I'm familiar with what registry review boards ask about. Thank you for the consideration. She picked up her equipment case. She nodded at the Meridian Compact's ramp. Your station is stable, she said. Columns 7 will need a full ring replacement in the next scheduled maintenance window. The reseat is a repair, not a permanent fix. You'll want a Class 1 structural team for that, and if the waiver process takes as long as it apparently did today, I'd recommend filing early. She paused. We've put in a 4th certification application. The documentation people are cautiously optimistic. I will note that in the file, I said. She looked at me again with that expression I had not been able to interpret earlier. I still could not, fully. There was something in it that was not unkind. Good, she said. She went up the ramp. The Meridian Compact's hatch closed. Through the equatorial bay's observation port, in the amber daylight of Devhari Prime's reflected bands, I watched 9 ships undock in the same orderly sequence in which they had arrived. There was no ceremony. There was no announcement on the station-wide channel. The Meridian Compact was the last to leave, and it went the way it had come, at a steady, unhurried pace that covered the distance without wasting anything. I went back to the intake office. The alert board was clear. The structural countdown had been removed from the station-wide display. Vasathi was in the director's office with the review board representative, who had arrived by emergency shuttle during the 7th hour, and through the glass partition, I could see the shape of a conversation I would need to participate in shortly, and I was not looking forward to it, not because I was afraid of the finding, but because I was tired, in a way that was not about the hours. Open the intake file for the Meridian Compact. I opened the rejection notice I had sent 14 months ago. I read the form letter, which explained the registry Class 1 requirement, and provided links to the certificate pathway, and expressed, in the standard phrasing, the Ostevry intake office's regret that the application could not be approved at this time, and its hope that the applicant would pursue the appropriate certification steps. Then I created a new file. I titled it Supplemental Intake Record, Meridian Compact and Associated Convoy, Emergency Service Event, Day 43 of the Devhari Summer Cycle. I recorded the names of all 9 vessels and their operators, as best I had collected them during the event. I recorded the nature of the services rendered, the duration, the scope, and the outcome. I recorded the authorization codes that Vasathi had provided. I recorded in the section that the intake form calls Evaluator's Notes, the following. The equipment deployed by the Meridian Compact and associated vessels exceeded the operational tolerances of the Ostevary, Column 7 Primary, seal ring. The structural work completed was of a quality that the review board may, upon inspection, wish to account for in their assessment of existing certification standards. The capability demonstrated was not in dispute. The documentation processes were, as noted in prior rejection records, the stated basis for the certification denial. I recommend that this record be included in the Meridian Compact's next certification application as supporting evidence of operational capability. I saved the file. I sent a copy to the Galactic Registry's Intake Review Office. I sent a copy to the Veth-Karal Extraction Consortium's Standards Committee. I sent a copy to Vasathi, who sent back a response that said only, "Good. Should have been done before." She was right. It should have been done before. Found that Vasathi's emergency access authorization was within the director's discretionary powers under the station safety, emergency provisions, and that no violation of registry protocol had occurred because the open band emergency frequency is not a registry channel and responses to it are not subject to registry endorsement requirements. This was a correct finding. It was also, I noted to myself, a finding that the registry's own policy had made possible. The emergency frequency, exemption exists precisely because the registry's founders understood that there would be situations in which the certified response network would be unavailable, and they had, to their credit, made room for that. The framework was not as rigid as I had been using it. I filed my own account with a review board. The review board asked me about the intake rejection. I told them the truth, that the rejection was correct under existing policy, and that existing policy had a gap in it, and that the gap had nearly cost 600 workers their lives. The board noted my account. They said they would take it under advisement. The Standards Committee has, I understand, been in correspondence with the Registry Certification Review Board since then. Do not know the outcome. I do not know if it will be the outcome I would choose. I know that I filed the supplemental intake record, and that it exists in the archive now, and that when the Meridian Compact submits its fourth certification application, there is a document alongside it that says what happened on day 43 of the Devhari summer cycle, and what the equipment was capable of, and what the outcome was. The Veth-Karal have a phrase very old from before the platform era, from the days when our ancestors built the first deep shaft mines in the chitinous rock formations of our home continent. It translates, approximately, as, "The hole in the ground does not care about your certification." It means that the physical world has requirements that precede the administrative world's requirements, and that when the two conflict, the physical world wins, and the only question is how much it costs you before you accept that. I had been an intake coordinator. I had been good at it. I had maintained clean records and high audit scores, and had never let a substandard contractor through the door. All of that was true, and I did not think it untrue after the cascade. What I thought, and what I still think, is that I had confused the map for the territory, had taken a framework built to prevent harm, and used it in a way that very nearly caused the precise harm it was designed to prevent. The registry certification process had a gap. The gap had a shape. The shape was the distance between what the documentation said and what a ship full of experienced people could actually do when the pressure ring failed. That distance is what I am trying to measure now, and I suspect I will be trying to measure it for the rest of my administrative career. I did not know Captain Hartwell's name before she arrived at Ostivari. I knew her as a file reference, a rejection record, an application that had not met the standard. I know her name now. I know that she studied under a Duvari engineer, and that she has been flying outside the registry's vendor list for 9 years, and that she carries a scanner and a hot drink and a tablet, and makes notes on all three, simultaneously. I know that she came when we called, and that she did not use any of the 7 hours to remind me of the form letter, or the 47 seconds of silence on the open frequency, or the 14 months of closed intake doors. She came because there were 600 workers. That was the relevant fact. I am not a person who cries easily. Veth-Karal are not, as a species, prone to demonstrative emotion. Our carapace structure makes many of the physical expressions of distress invisible to outside observers, and our culture has, in any case, evolved toward internal processing. I tell you this not as a character reference, but as context for what I have to say, which is that in the intake office on the evening of day 43, after I had filed the supplemental record and the review board account and sent the copies to the relevant offices, and closed the alert board and turned off the structural countdown display, I sat at my console for approximately 11 minutes doing nothing. I was not processing the day's events. I was not constructing the account I would eventually give to my breeding sister Osvith. I was, as best I can reconstruct it, simply sitting with the specific weight of the thing I had learned, which was that I had been wrong in a way that had a precise dimension. 7 hours, 9 vessels, 612 workers. One form letter sent 14 months ago, and that the wrongness and the precision of it were both going to be with me for a long time. In those 11 minutes, I also thought about the young engineer in the corridor, the one with the squint and the tolerance calculation, who had said, "That's what we do." I thought about it not as a philosophical statement but as a logistical one. It was what they did. They came when called. They brought what was needed. They worked until it was done, and they left. There was no ceremony in it. There was no ledger. The hole in the ground does not care about your certification, and apparently neither did they. Then I closed the intake log. I wrote 3 items on my task list for the following day. Review the Emergency Access Authorization Protocol, follow up on the Column 7 replacement window, and update the intake evaluation criteria to include operational capability documentation as a supplemental consideration alongside registry certification status. Then I went to find Vasathi, because there was a review board report to write, and it needed to be honest, and the 2 of us were the right people to write it. The station was quiet, the way a station goes quiet after a thing has passed through it. The alert board was clear, or full of the ordinary sounds of 612 workers doing the work that they were alive to do. I walked through them, and I thought about a convoy of 9 ships, no markings I recognized, heading out into the amber light of Devery Prime's reflected bands. Outside the registry, outside the vendor list, outside the form letters' carefully correct language, and the certification requirements, and the 14 months of closed intake doors. Outside all of that, and there when it mattered.